The Galactic Council killed the last human, or so they thought. The chair they gave me was too tall for the desk. I noticed that first, not the 7 judges, not the 17 alien faces staring down at me from their curved bench, not the cold blue light that made everything in the chamber look like it was already dead. The chair. It had been designed for a species with longer legs than mine, and my feet did not quite touch the floor, and I had to sit there like a child brought in to receive a scolding, while they read out the formal conclusion of what they called the pacification of soul. The lead arbiter was a Vethari, gray-skinned and slow-moving, 4 small eyes arranged in a row above a wide, lipless mouth, a voice like stones settling at the bottom of a cold river. His name was something I could not pronounce without the right kind of throat, so in my head I called him the reader. He had been reading documents in that flat, even voice for 2 hours before they brought me in. I could tell by the stack of papers still in front of him when I sat down. The environmental impact assessment of Earth, the psychological risk profile of the human species, compiled over 40 years of observation, the Galactic Stability Index, which had given humanity a score of -42, whatever that was supposed to mean. Then, at last, he picked up the final sheet and read the sentence. The human species, classified as Category Omega, has been designated an existential threat to galactic order. Sterilization of the home system was carried out 14 months ago. All biological and cultural remnants on the surface of Sol 3 have been rendered non-viable. The species is hereby declared extinct. He paused. He always paused here. I later learned not for effect, but because Vethari legal convention required a 2-breath interval before the secondary pronouncement. The secondary pronouncement was about me. The surviving specimen was retained for study purposes and will continue to exist under the supervision of the Council Research Division, provided she remains compliant. The surviving specimen, compliant, 2 words that were meant to define the entire remaining territory of my existence. I held them in my mind and turned them over the way you turn over something that might cut you, trying to understand its shape before you commit to holding it. My name is Clara Oren. I am 34 years old. I was born in a small town in northern England, where the rain comes in sideways off the moors, and the sky is the color of old pewter for half the year, and everyone learns very young that the weather does not care what you had planned. I grew up in a house that smelled of damp wool and library books, with a grandmother who sang off-key in the kitchen, and believed that any problem could be improved by tea and made worse by panicking. I became a xenobiologist because when I was 11 years old I found a lichen colony growing in the crack of a car park wall, and I could not understand why anything would choose to live there. And then I could not stop being fascinated by the answer, which was that life does not choose difficult places out of any kind of nobility. It simply chooses to continue, in whatever crack is available, because continuing is what life does. I spent a decade chasing that question through universities and research positions across 3 continents and eventually all the way off the planet, to a research platform orbiting a gas giant in the Kepler system. I had been there 4 years, cataloging the microbial life forms in the planet's upper atmosphere when the broadcast came through. It came on the standard frequency. It sat between a trade route advisory and a weather report for the Dravosi shipping lanes, because the Council's communications team had categorized it as a general information update rather than what it actually was, which was the announcement that a planet and everyone born on it no longer existed. I was eating breakfast. I had a bowl of reconstituted oat porridge and a cup of coffee that was never quite right no matter what I did with the machine, and the broadcast played over the platform's ambient feed, while I was thinking about whether oat porridge was worth the effort of reconstituting. I put the spoon down. I listened a second time, a third. Then I sat very still for what felt like a long while, in the particular way you sit still when something enormous has happened and your body has not yet caught up with your mind. There is a strange quality to that moment, a sharpness, almost a brightness, where everything small becomes very clear. The temperature of the air, the sound of the recycling system cycling through its sequence, the way the light from the viewport fell across the table in a long pale stripe. I noticed all of those things with complete attention, while the larger thing sat in me like something swallowed the wrong way, too large to move quickly. Then I finished the porridge, because my grandmother had been very firm on the subject of wasting food, and because decisions made on an empty stomach are always worse than the alternative, and because I needed to think, and thinking requires fuel. The council brought me to their central station 2 months later. They were polite about it in the particular way of institutions that have made a decision and are now managing the administrative consequences of it. They sent a transport with a comfortable cabin and an attendant, a young Dravosi with a careful manner, and an evident awareness that his situation was awkward, who offered food at regular intervals and apologized for turbulence as though that were the thing troubling me. The transport was clean and the food was adequate, and the journey took 9 days. And for 9 days I sat in a cabin with a window that faced the stars, and I read everything I could access about the Council's legal structure, and the history of its founding charter, and the specific provisions of the Galactic Accord on Sapient Species Rights, which ran to 1,100 pages in its standard edition. I had read all of it before the transport docked. The tribunal was a formality. I understood that before they put me in the too-tall chair. It was a commemoration in the clothing of a legal process, the kind of ritual that institutions perform when they need a record to show that proper procedures were observed. They needed me to be present so that the file could note my presence, so that the documentation would show the last human had been informed and had raised no objection that the record needed to account for. I did not object, not aloud, not in any form that would show up on a transcript. What I did was look at every face in that chamber very carefully. I looked at the judges, one by one, until each of them had either held my gaze or looked away. I looked at the delegates in the gallery. I looked at the administrative staff arranged along the walls, and I counted the ones that could not hold my gaze. 4 of the Vethari delegates looked away. 2 of the Dravosi. 1 representative from a species I did not yet know the name of, small and amber-colored with long many-jointed fingers that they kept pressing together in a gesture that might have been a nervous habit or might have been a formal expression of discomfort. 7 faces total that looked away before I did. I filed every single one in the precise part of my memory where I keep things that are going to matter later. After the formal reading, there was a reception. I include that detail not for dramatic effect, but because it is accurate, and because it tells you something important about the kind of organization the council was. There was a long table with food items selected to be compatible with multiple biologies, and there was soft music, and there were delegates moving through the room in small groups making the sounds of satisfied species. I was given a glass of something pale and fizzy that tasted faintly of apples. A council communications officer, young, bronze-skinned, with the kind of formal enthusiasm that comes from a recent appointment, told me I should feel honored to be preserved, that history would remember the council's mercy. I told him I was sure it would. I kept my voice pleasant and my expression agreeable, and I watched his face relax into the assumption that I was cooperative, which is a very useful assumption to have people make about you. I found a spot near the far wall where the light was slightly dimmer, and I stood there with my drink, and I thought very carefully. I thought about my research platform, about the standard xenobiology field kit that every certified researcher carries, which includes cryostorage rated for 10,000 biological samples at long-term preservation temperatures. I thought about the 18 months before I left for the Kepler system, and a trip home to England for what had turned out to be my grandmother's last Christmas. I thought about stopping in Oslo on the way back, because I had been working on a paper about terrestrial microbial diversity, and because a woman named Dr. Petra Holst ran a small facility there that I had known about since graduate school, and because I had packed my collection kit very carefully before I went to see her. I thought about what the word category means in the context of a standard collection log. I thought about the specific difference between a complete absence and an apparent absence, and how much that difference could matter, and to whom. The communications officer drifted back to check on me. I told him it had been a genuinely moving ceremony. He seemed sincerely pleased. I finished my drink, set the glass on a passing tray, and went back to my assigned quarters. I sat at the desk and opened a new document. I labeled it Research Proposal, Preliminary Notes. They had given me a library card, a research terminal, and a continuation mandate. Document your species' biological and cultural knowledge for the Galactic Archive. They had given me a purpose and a room, and the assumption that I would stay quietly inside both of them. They had made a calculation about what the last human was likely to do with her time and her grief and her singular, solitary situation. The calculation was reasonable. It was based on everything they knew about me, which was what I had chosen to let them see. It was going to be a long few years. I have always preferred long projects. They give you more room to be thorough, and thorough, in my experience, is the only approach that actually works. The platform looked exactly as I had left it. Gray cylinder, stuck docking clamp, the particular quality of recycled air that picks up the memory of whatever was cooked too often and holds it for months. I had 10 days before the first scheduled compliance check, and I used every hour of those 10 days in a specific order that I had planned on the transport back. I began with a complete physical inventory of everything on the platform. Not a systems check. I knew the systems. I meant I walked through every room with a notepad and wrote down everything that was there, what condition it was in, what it could theoretically be used for if the intended use were set aside, and you thought about the object with fresh eyes. I did this because I had learned, in years of field work, that the resources you already have are almost always more varied than you realize when you are in the middle of using them for their designated purpose. You have to step back. You have to look at things as though you have never seen them before. Here is what I found. The platform was rated for a crew of 6. That meant 6 sleeping quarters, a full medical bay with surgical capacity and pharmaceutical stores, 3 separate laboratory workrooms, a kitchen rated for multi-species dietary requirements, a common area, an engineering bay with fabrication tools sufficient for component-level repair of most standard equipment, and a greenhouse module attached to the starboard side that I had been using for food cultivation and soil biology experiments. Independent power generation with a rated life of approximately 20 years before the core would need replacement. 3 years of emergency food stores beyond whatever I grew in the greenhouse. An atmospheric management system good enough to keep me alive in the event of a significant hull event for up to 72 hours while a repair was made. It was not luxurious, but it was mine in the way that places become yours when you have lived inside them long enough, when you know that the cooling system drops half a tone around the 4th hour of the night cycle, when you know which panel in the engineering bay makes a click sound when the temperature changes, when you know that the air in the greenhouse smells different from the air everywhere else, green and alive in a way that nothing else on the platform quite managed to be. I had made this place productive. It knew my habits. That felt, under the circumstances, like a form of safety. The cryo-storage unit in Lab 2 was the thing I checked most carefully. Standard field unit, grade 4, rated for 10,000 samples at long-term preservation temperatures, with a battery backup capable of maintaining temperature for 96 hours in the event of a primary power failure. It was approximately 2/3 full. The contents were cataloged as Terrestrial Biome Diversity Study, which was accurate. It was, technically, a diversity study of one of the most biodiverse environments Earth had produced. The council auditors had reviewed the catalog entry on my first mandatory check-in, 18 months before the vote. They had noted the samples without concern and moved on. Field sample collections are entirely routine for a xenobiologist. There was nothing about the label that should have caught anyone's attention, and nothing about the external appearance of the unit that distinguished it from any other cryo-storage container in any other xenobiology lab in council space. I opened it and checked every sample, every single one. It took 4 hours and I did not skip a single tray, all viable, all within acceptable temperature variance, all exactly as they had been when I last checked, 3 days before the council transport had arrived to collect me. I had been checking them every 3 days without fail for 2 years. Some habits are too important to let slip. The story of how those samples came to be there is a short one, though the decision behind it was not. 18 months before I left Earth for the Kepler assignment, I went home for my grandmother's last Christmas. We had known it was likely to be her last, she was 87, and had the look of someone who had decided they were done, not with defeat but with a kind of settled completion, the way a long day ends. We spent a week together and she sang off-key in the kitchen and we watched old films she had seen 50 times, and she told me on the last evening that the thing she had most enjoyed about being alive was being surprised by it. She said, "You think you know what is coming and then something entirely different happens, and if you are paying attention, that is the best part." I thought about that on the transport to Oslo the following day. Dr. Petra Holst was the director of a facility that had been running quietly and on inadequate funding for 17 years. She was small and careful, with a researcher's hands and a coffee smell that had become structural. The project she ran was called the Human Continuity Record, which was an academic title for something that was, at its core, a very old and very human impulse. The impulse to make sure that something important did not disappear just because the situation it existed in became difficult. She had not been expecting me specifically, but she had the look of someone who had been half expecting someone like me, eventually, and was relieved that the someone had arrived before it was too late to matter. She asked me 2 questions: how long did I have, and did I have adequate storage? I told her. She took me through the facility without any unnecessary ceremony. She showed me the work with the quiet pride of someone whose best effort had been good and patient and largely unrecognized. What I packed into my standard regulation cryostorage unit, properly logged under primate biological samples, Sol 3, was the possibility of a future. I will not specify further than that in this account, because the Council's administrative teams will eventually read whatever survives of this period, and making their work easy is not something I have any obligation to do. What I will say is that Dr. Petra Holst was the best scientist I ever met, and also the most quietly courageous person, and I think about her a great deal. The second significant thing in my inventory was the Ansible transmitter. Ansible communication, instantaneous long-range transmission, was council-controlled technology. Private ownership was not permitted for non-council species, full stop, no exceptions and no gray areas. I had one anyway. I had built it over approximately 8 months, in the hours of the night cycle, when the platform's monitoring systems were at their lowest activity, from components that were individually legal and collectively an assembly, that the regulations had not imagined necessary to prohibit specifically, because who would bother? Who would spend 8 months building a thing that wasn't supposed to exist, from pieces that were each allowed, in a lab that was being audited quarterly? I had been helped in this by a Dravosi engineer named Oswin Cole, who had spent a 6-month rotation on the platform 2 years before the vote. Oswin was one of those people who experience regulations primarily as intellectual puzzles rather than instructions, and who had a gift for reading the precise letter of a rule and finding the exact space between what the letter prohibited and what the spirit intended. He had helped me source the components and had walked me through the assembly theory, while officially working on a maintenance project in the engineering bay. He was thorough and he was precise, and he left the platform at the end of his rotation without saying anything about any of it to anyone. I hoped he was somewhere safe. The transmitter was inside the atmospheric analysis unit in Lab 2, fitted into the housing of what appeared on every external scan to be a standard calibration module, because Oswin had been very careful about the casework. The third thing in my inventory was information, and information is harder to catalog than physical objects, but I will try. 4 years of attending every mandatory council briefing, every compliance seminar, every interspecies coordination meeting that I was permitted to sit in on. 4 years of reading council policy documents, because they were the only things in the platform library that were guaranteed to be current, and current information about how an institution operates is among the most valuable things a person in my position can accumulate. 4 years of listening to the way the council talked about itself in administrative language, the specific words it chose and avoided, the distinctions it made between categories of concern, the patterns that revealed where the real disagreements were being managed under the surface of formal consensus. The council presented itself as a unified body. Governing bodies always do. In practice, it was 17 competing interests held together by mutual benefit and the shared understanding that open fracture would be worse for everyone than managed tension. The extinction vote had not been unanimous, 11-6. That margin was significant not because 6 votes could reverse a decision. They could not, but because 6 votes meant 6 delegations who had publicly committed to a position that the council's majority had gone against, and 6 delegations in that position had both a reason to want the record corrected and a structural vulnerability if they did nothing. I found the archived vote record. I cross-referenced every delegation against everything I knew about their internal politics, their economic relationships with other council members, their historical positions on sapient species rights, and their likely concerns about what the extinction precedent meant for their own future security in a council that had just demonstrated it would act on a simple majority in 11 days. Then I looked at the Vethari record for a long time. Elder Ven, senior member of the Vethari Science and Ethics Committee, 70 years in council service, which for a species with a natural lifespan of 200 years meant he was experienced but not yet at the limit of his influence. Author of the paper on sapient species rights in territorial disputes, which was still cited in every relevant legal argument filed in the past 30 years. A reputation, documented in the academic record, for being slow and deliberate in forming positions, and then holding them with a steadiness that had outlasted 4 council administrations. He had voted no, and he had looked at me at the tribunal longer than anyone else before finally looking away. I spent 3 days writing my first transmission to him. Not 3 afternoons, 3 full days, 8 to 10 hours each, drafting and revising, reading sentences aloud to an empty room, considering every word from the perspective of a Vethari ethicist who had no particular reason to trust me. Too much emotion, and he would file me as unstable. Too much calculation, and he would recognize the manipulation and close the channel before I could make my actual case. I needed him to understand 2 things simultaneously: that I was fully aware of the exact nature and severity of my situation, and that I was thinking about it with complete rationality and without the distortion that grief or panic would produce. I framed it as a research exchange. The Vethari agricultural colonies on the outer worlds had been struggling for decades with a specific and documented problem: the progressive collapse of soil microbiome networks that made their farmed land productive. Their scientists had published extensively on the problem. The solutions they had tried had worked partially and temporarily. I had 4 years of Earth-based soil microbiome research, techniques developed across centuries of human farming in climates that were, by any galactic standard, remarkably difficult, and the specific technical expertise to adapt those techniques to non-terrestrial soil chemistry. I offered all of it freely. No conditions, no preliminary agreements, no structured exchange. Just the research in full from me to him, because the Vethari farming communities needed it, and because I was trying to demonstrate something about the kind of species I was. I sent the transmission through the Ansible at 300 hours during the narrowest window of monitoring coverage, then went to the greenhouse and pulled weeds for 2 hours. Pulling weeds is physical and requires just enough attention to stop the mind from circling the same thoughts repeatedly, which is a problem I have when waiting. I have a lot of weeds in that greenhouse. I have always been grateful for that. His reply came 11 days later. For a Vethari, 11 days was close to impulsive. It said, "I received your transmission. I have read it carefully. I will read it again. Do not send further messages until I contact you." 4 sentences. I read them 4 times in order from the beginning. Then I allowed myself something I had not allowed since the reception. Not certainty. Certainty was nowhere near justified yet. Not relief. Something earlier than either of those. The faint, cautious, stubbornly persistent thing that lives before both of them and does not require either of them to be real. Hope. The kind that exists before it has been tested, fragile as a lichen colony in a car park wall, and just as committed to continuing regardless. The first compliance check arrived 3 days after Elder Ven's message. 2 auditors from the Council Research Division, a Keth and a junior Dravosi. They spent 6 hours going through my research logs, my supply inventory, my communications record, and my quarterly psychological assessment questionnaire. My communications record showed only internal platform logs and 2 outgoing submissions to the Galactic Archive Human Cultural Documents, as per the continuation mandate. The Atmospheric Analysis Unit in Lab 2 showed a calibration module on the equipment manifest. The auditors reviewed the manifest. They did not physically examine the unit. The Keth lead auditor had the flat, efficient manner of someone doing assigned work in the correct way without being particularly interested in it. She asked me standard questions. I gave her standard answers. I was cooperative and detailed, and did not volunteer anything beyond what was asked, because volunteering information is a habit that draws attention to the act of volunteering, and I did not want anyone paying attention to what I was or was not choosing to share. The Dravosi junior auditor was different. He was younger, with the kind of careful watchfulness that sometimes comes from people who are genuinely paying attention rather than completing a process. At one point, while the Keth was reviewing my greenhouse production logs at the far end of the module, the Dravosi stopped near the starboard viewport and looked out at the stars for a moment. Just stood there, looking. I went and stood nearby. Not close. Just near, in the way you stand when you are not trying to start a conversation, but you are not trying to avoid one either. He said, without turning his head, "I studied xenobiology for 2 years before I transferred to administrative work." I said, "What made you transfer?" He said, "It seemed more stable." A pause. The cooling system made its small sound in the wall. He said, "I am sorry, about soul. I know that is not adequate. I wanted to say it anyway." I said, "It is worth something that you said it." He did not reply to that. He went back to his clipboard. But when they reached Lab 2 and worked through the equipment check, he initialed the Atmospheric Analysis Station's entry without physically opening the housing to check the interior components. He signed the form. They collected their documentation and they left. I do not know what he knew or suspected. I do not know whether the serial number on the calibration module matched the manifest to the last digit, or whether he simply had no specific reason to look more carefully. What I know is that the form was signed, and the transmitter was still exactly where it should be, and I was still standing, which was the only outcome that mattered. Elder Ven's second message came 2 weeks later. It was substantially longer. It asked 8 specific technical questions about my soil microbiome research methodology and requested 3 particular datasets from the Oslo study notes. I answered every question in full and sent all 3 datasets with complete documentation. Then I added one additional paragraph that he had not asked for written in the neutral, conditional language of a research hypothetical, describing what else I had in the cryo-storage unit in Lab 2, and what I had reason to believe could be accomplished with it given the right facilities, the right technical expertise, and the right conditions for a long-term study. I framed it as a question. I asked him what the Vethari Ethics Committee would consider, hypothetically, the minimum biological and institutional conditions required to formally classify a species as not yet fully extinct. His reply took 3 weeks. 1 sentence. It said that would depend entirely on whether any viable material remained, and in what quantity. I sat with that sentence in the quiet of the platform for a long time. I read it slowly several times. I thought about what it committed to and what it left open. I thought about what a Vethari ethicist with 70 years of counsel experience meant by the word depend, which is not a word you use when you have already closed the question. Then I composed an inventory, clean, precise, technical. Every item counted and described in the specific terms a developmental biologist would need in order to make a professional assessment. I sent it without additional commentary. Then I went to the greenhouse and sat on the floor between the planting rows, in the green smell of living soil, and let myself believe, carefully, proportionately, without getting ahead of what I actually had, that this was the first day of something that did not yet have an ending. Trust is the hardest thing to build when the stakes are highest. That is not a complaint. It is just a fact about the nature of trust, which requires exactly the conditions most likely to undermine it. Time, patience, repeated small acts of reliability, and the willingness to accept that you cannot control how the other person will respond. I had been trained as a scientist, which meant I was trained to be comfortable with uncertainty and deeply uncomfortable with rushing. In this, at least, my situation and my temperament were aligned. Elder Venn and I built trust in the only way it can be built, slowly, through work, through specificity, through the accumulation of small, accurate promises kept. I sent him the soil research data in installments, each one complete and documented and exactly as useful as I had promised it would be. He sent back questions that showed he was reading carefully, not skimming. The questions became more specific over the months. The specificity was itself a form of trust. You do not ask specific questions about things you are not taking seriously. The messages between us grew longer, not immediately and not in any single step, but gradually, the way light changes on a winter morning, so incrementally that you cannot mark the exact moment it shifted, only notice at some point that you are in something different from what you started in. He began to include, alongside the soil science questions, occasional observations about the state of the Council's internal discussions on the species rights framework. Not information he was required to share with me. Information he chose to share because he had begun, I thought, to understand that I was not simply asking for help. I was building something, and the thing I was building required him to understand what I was building it for. What he was willing to say, eventually, was this. The Vethari home system administered 3 moons designated for agricultural research use. One of them, a small body called Venari, had a biodome facility that had been placed in maintenance status 6 years earlier due to a budget reduction that the Vethari Science Committee had never fully accepted. The facility was structurally intact. It maintained a minimal power draw for climate and structural systems. In Council administrative terminology, it was categorized as mothballed pending review, which had a specific procedural meaning. The facility would not be subject to external inspection or audit for a minimum of 10 years from the date of the categorization. unless a specific review request was filed by a council member with standing. No such request had been filed. Elder Venn said he could arrange to have the facility quietly reactivated as an extension of my ongoing soil microbiome research, creating a formal official purpose that would satisfy the administrative requirement for the power draw increase and the supply requisitions. The equipment transfers and the staffing could be processed through the Vethari Science Committee's discretionary operational budget, which was approved annually and did not require council-wide review for individual line items below a specific threshold. He needed time. He needed my research data to continue arriving in regular installments as official justification for the ongoing communication between the platform and Venari. He needed nothing else from me yet. He did not mention the other thing. I did not mention it either. We had arrived at the same understanding through separate paths, that what we were building required a foundation solid enough to hold the weight of what it was for, and that weight had to be established before it was named, because naming it too early would give the wrong people a target before the thing being named was ready to exist. The facility needed someone on site. Elder Venn could manage the administrative side from his position on the ethics committee, but he was 70 years old and held a seat that required his presence at the central station, and the facility needed working hands, working knowledge, and the specific scientific competence to do what the facility was being built to do. He needed someone who was already part of the system, already placed in council space, already operating under some form of supervised continuation, who could be given an official reason to be on Venari without the reason requiring explanation to anyone who might ask. He found her through a method he described, in the careful language we had developed for our correspondence, as existing relationships within the Vethari academic network. I never learned the specific chain of connections. I did not need to. Her name was Dr. Nora Gill, 31 years old, born in Kent in the south of England, grew up near the coast where the chalk cliffs come down to the water. She had her undergraduate degree in biology, her doctorate in xenobiological systems, and a publication record that any researcher twice her age would have been proud of. She had been off-world for 3 years when the vote happened, on a Dravosi research station, in the final year of a collaborative study on atmospheric biology in dense gas environments. She had come back to a situation roughly parallel to mine. Off-world human, retained under supervised continuation, assigned to a research position at a Vethari university that provided her with a professional existence and almost nothing else. She was doing the work with complete excellence. I learned this from reading her published output before we ever communicated. Her papers were precise, and her methodology was rigorous, and she wrote about complex systems with a clarity that suggested she understood them all the way down. She was good at her work in the way that is quieter than ambition and more durable, the way that comes from genuinely caring about the questions, not the recognition. When Elder Venn's offer reached her, relayed through the academic connection I never fully traced, she asked 2 questions. First, is this real? Second, when do I start? Our first direct contact came through the secure routing system Elder Venn had constructed, a series of relays through academic data channels that moved too much volume for individual message monitoring. She wrote 6 words, "I heard you have a plan." Then, on a second line, "I hope it is a very good one." I wrote back, "It is a thorough one. Thorough will have to do." She replied, "I have worked with thorough my whole career. I can work with thorough." I liked her immediately, without qualification or reservation. That does not happen to me often. I have learned to be careful about people, the way you are careful when you have been working alone for a long time, and you understand how much you are capable of wanting someone to be trustworthy. But Nora was the kind of person whose precision of language and economy of expression told you something true about how their mind worked, And what her mind told me in 6 words and one follow-up was that she was paying full attention and had already assessed the situation and had made her decision without flinching from what the decision meant. That is rare. I noted it. I kept it. The Venari facility came online 8 months after Elder Ven's first commitment. Nora confirmed readiness in her characteristic way, temperature systems holding to specification, containment integrity confirmed at all points, sample handling protocols in place and tested. It read like every other field confirmation report in the Galactic Archive. It was the most important set of sentences I had ever read in my life, and they were deliberately unremarkable, because unremarkable was safe and safe was everything. The first procedures began in the weeks that followed. I will not go into technical detail here. I will say that Nora was extraordinarily careful, that she documented every step with the rigor of someone who intended the work to be peer-reviewed one day, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because that was how she worked. Her updates came in the form of field log excerpts embedded in routine data transfers, dry, factual, numbered. I read every one of them 4 or 5 times, translating the careful neutral language into what it actually meant, which was that things were proceeding. Things were viable. Things were alive. Oren Ahav joined 3 months after Nora. Elder Ven had identified him through the published record, a Vethari developmental biologist with specific expertise in multi-species gestational research, a career's worth of precise technical work, and a vote at the tribunal that had been no. Elder Ven approached him privately, with the careful indirection of a man who had spent 70 years working in systems that required you to never say anything directly that could be said through implication. Oren had one condition. He related to Elder Ven without, apparently, a great deal of deliberation. He said, "I will not attend another event like the tribunal, not as an observer and not as anything else." Elder Ven relayed this to me. I wrote back, "That condition seems entirely reasonable. Please tell him it is accepted without reservation." And so there were 3 of them on Venari. Nora, who ran the technical side with her precise and efficient competence. Oren, who brought specialist knowledge that I could not have supplied from here and who managed his considerable discomfort with the situation by focusing on the work with the kind of professional seriousness that turns discomfort into fuel. And Fenari. Fenari was not a scientist. She was young, Vethari, assigned to the facility as a junior operations assistant, the person who made sure the systems were maintained, and the supplies were stocked, and the endless small administrative requirements of a functioning research facility were met. She did all of this with complete reliability and without drama, and she was curious in the way that some people are curious before the world has had time to make them less so. Openly, without calculation, about everything that came across her attention. She sent me messages sometimes, through the secure channel, alongside the official log transfers, tucked into the metadata in a format that looked like automated system flags. They were questions about human things she had encountered in my cultural archive submissions. Chess was the first one. She wanted to know the point of it. I wrote her a 4-page explanation with 2 diagrams, and a short section on why people play games that are deliberately difficult, which turned into a longer section than I had planned because it is actually a complex question. Then she asked about bank holidays, why a society would designate specific days as mandatory rest. Then she asked about the human habit of nomming vehicles, because she had found references to it in several different cultural documents and could not understand the logic. Then she asked whether it was true that humans believed talking to plants helped them grow, because she had started talking to the cultures in the facility lab and wanted to know whether this was scientifically justified or just a thing people did. I told her, it is mostly a thing people do. The science suggests that the attention paid to a plant during verbal interaction, checking its condition, noticing changes, adjusting care based on what you see, produces better outcomes than the speech itself. But the attention is real, and the care is real, and if talking is what makes you pay careful attention, then the outcomes are the same. She wrote back, "That makes sense. I told them about chess today. The explanation you gave me, I think they were listening." I put down the tablet. The sound that came out of me was not a laugh exactly. It was the shape of a laugh, the space where a laugh would go, and something in the chest that unclenched very slightly, the way a hand releases something it has been holding too tightly for too long. I had not realized how tightly I had been holding everything until that small, absurd message arrived and made me feel, for a moment, like a person again rather than a project. The quarterly compliance checks continued. I maintained the platform with the care of someone who takes pride in the work, which was both genuine and useful. My publication record in the xenobiology journals held steady. My cultural archive submissions went out on schedule. My psychological assessments came back marked stable and cooperative, which was the only assessment that was ever going to be generated by an assessor who had no reason to believe anything else. 14 months in, a compliance check arrived with a Keth auditor who was more attentive than any of the previous ones. She was broad-shouldered and deliberate, and she moved through the labs with the specific focus of someone actually looking rather than completing a checklist in the most efficient way possible. She checked the equipment against the manifest in Lab 2. She went unit by unit. She reached the atmospheric analysis station. I was standing in the doorway. I did not move. I kept my expression at the particular setting, not too interested, not too neutral of someone watching a routine process proceed as expected. She checked the external serial number against her list. She looked at the calibration module inside the housing. She reached out and put her hand on it. I have, in the time since, reconstructed that moment many times. The 6 or 7 seconds during which she held her hand on the exterior of the component, and I stood in the doorway and neither of us moved. I remember the sound of the platform's cooling system. I remember the way the light fell across the bench at that particular time of the day cycle. I remember the quality of the air and the feeling of my own breath, very deliberate, in and out, not fast, not irregular. She withdrew her hand. She made a notation on her pad. She moved to the next unit. I do not know whether the serial numbers matched to the last digit. I know that Oswin had been very careful about the housing, and that I had been very careful about the documentation, and that the atmospheric analysis unit looked, in every external particular, exactly like an atmospheric analysis unit that had been functioning and properly maintained, and had nothing inside it that should not be there. I know that in the absence of a specific and stated reason to look more carefully, most inspectors do not look more carefully. They are looking for what they have been told to look for, and a compliant research station staffed by a compliant surviving specimen was not the kind of situation that typically required going beyond the standard checklist. They left. I filed the certification with the compliance office. I went to the greenhouse and sat on the floor between the planting rows for a long time. Nora's update arrived that evening. Cohort development within expected range across all categories. Temperature differential stable. Orin satisfied with current trajectory. Fenari has been giving what she describes as educational briefings. Current topic apparently the concept of games that are deliberately difficult. Unclear how the briefings are being received. I sent back, keep going. She sent back every day, no exceptions. That was enough. That was exactly what I needed it to be. 18 months after my return to the platform, Elder Venn sent me something without any accompanying message. It was an image file, embedded in a routine data packet, labeled with a timestamp and nothing else. The interior of the Venari Biodome facility. White walls, clean and even. A row of incubation chambers arranged along the far wall. Each chamber was lit from within by a faint, warm, steady glow. I had taken a photograph of that same room on the day Nora first confirmed it was ready. Bare shelves, empty benches, new lighting, the room before. I put the two images side by side on my tablet, and sat with them. The difference between those two photographs was the distance between a plan and a fact, between what I had intended and what was now, in some fragile and irreversible way, beginning to be real. I did not have words for it that satisfied me. I had images. Those two images which I kept on my tablet and looked at every few days, not because I needed reminding, but because some things should be looked at, not filed away, not managed, just seen. I started writing a letter that night. I wrote it over many nights after that, adding to it in the spaces between work and sleep, in the way you work on something that you cannot rush and should not rush. I addressed it to the facility at Venari, not to any person in particular, because the people it was really for did not yet have names in any language I had access to. I told them, "You are beginning in a place that has no history yet. That is one of the rarer things a person can be given, a place that does not know what it is supposed to be yet. Pay attention to that. It will not last long, but it matters while it lasts." I told them, "You are not the end of something. You are a question that someone decided to keep asking. Questions do not have endings. They have answers, and answers generate more questions, and that chain of not quite arriving is what I have always found most interesting about being alive." I told them, "Learn chess. Learn it properly, all the way to the end game. Someone should make sure someone teaches you the end game." The document that ended the quiet period did not come through any dramatic channel. It did not announce itself. It arrived in the same format as the administrative updates that appeared every few weeks, the kind of documents that accumulate in a research division's incoming queue without urgency, that are filed and occasionally reviewed, and mostly exist to confirm that some monitoring system is still running and still generating output. I almost did not open it immediately. It was late in the evening cycle, and I had been working on a supplemental section of the Cultural Archive submission for most of the day, and I was tired in the specific way that comes from a full day of careful writing, not physically exhausted but mentally used up, the way a field that has been harvested feels used up, productive and spent at the same time. I was going to leave it until the morning. Something made me open it instead. The subject line said, "Venari Biodome Facility Compliance Inquiry, raised by Council Administrative Review, Second Tier." I read the line twice, then I opened the document. Second tier had a specific meaning in Council Administrative Procedure. It was not an audit. An audit required a formal initiation process and a minimum notice period and specific legal authority granted by the Research Division. Second tier was the stage before an audit, the preliminary assessment phase, where something had been flagged by an automated monitoring system or a routine cross-reference check as potentially warranting further examination. Not enough to justify full audit authority yet, but enough to justify closer attention. The inquiry listed 3 items of concern. The first was an irregular pattern in the supply requisitions processed through the Vethari Science Committee's discretionary operational budget over the preceding 14 months. No single requisition was large enough to trigger automatic review. But the pattern across the 14 months showed a sustained operational tempo, regular, consistent, incrementally increasing purchases in categories consistent with active biological research, rather than the sporadic low-level draw that a mothballed facility in maintenance status would produce. The second item was a power consumption anomaly at the Venari facility itself. The facility's registered power draw had been increasing steadily for 14 months, again at a rate consistent with active equipment use, and was now running at approximately 60% of the operational capacity that the facility's equipment manifest would support. A mothballed facility in minimal maintenance mode should have been drawing around 12%. The third item was what made the blood run cold in a very specific way. The automated monitoring system that tracked communication patterns from research platforms under supervised continuation status had flagged an anomaly in the outgoing transmission records for Platform 7. The flag did not identify the content of what was being transmitted or the destination. It had simply noted that the transmission timing on outgoing data from Platform 7 showed a consistent pattern, a strong correlation with the narrowest windows of monitoring system coverage. That was not consistent with the random variation typical of standard research output, and was therefore potentially indicative of intentional scheduling around monitoring cycles. The system could not prove anything. It had noticed a pattern that did not look like noise, and it had noted the non-randomness, and it had escalated the flag to second-tier review. I sat with the document for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I checked the time when I opened it and checked again when I started moving. The thing about second-tier review is that it has a defined escalation timeline. If the preliminary assessment finds sufficient grounds, it proceeds to first-tier review, which carries physical inspection authority, the right to send a team to the location being assessed, to examine equipment and records on site without the standard notice period. The timeline from second-tier flag to first-tier authority was between 72 and 96 hours, depending on the complexity of the assessment and whether additional flags corroborated the original. I had 90 hours at most, probably fewer. The first thing I did was send a message to Elder Venn. I kept it to 12 words, which was the length of what I needed to say. Inquiry filed. Second tier. Venari in scope. 90 hours. What can you do? Then I waited. I did not contact the facility directly. Elder Venn had told me in one of our earlier communications that if a situation arose requiring rapid response, the correct protocol was to send through his channel and hold position until he confirmed it was safe to move. I followed that instruction. I sat at my desk and I thought through every contingency I had planned for and every contingency I might not have fully planned for, and I worked out what I was going to do regardless of what Elder Venn's response said. His response came 4 hours and 11 minutes later, the fastest I had ever received anything from him. It said, "I am already moving. Trust me and do not contact the facility directly." I did not contact the facility. I opened the folder that contained the document I had been constructing since the second month of my continuation. 47 pages. A formal legal petition addressed to the Council's Judicial Charter Office, arguing that the extinction vote had constituted a violation of Article 12 of the Galactic Accord on Sapient Species Rights. I had started building it the week after I returned to the platform from the tribunal. I had started it not because I expected to use it immediately. I did not. But because I knew there would be a moment when I needed it and I wanted to need it, and have it rather than need it and not. I had worked on it in small sections, a few pages at a time, over the course of many months, so that it would look in my research logs like background reading and document preparation for the continuation mandate rather than what it was. Article 12 of the Galactic Accord was specific and explicit in its language. It stated that no species designated as sapient under Article 4 could be subject to terminal action of any kind without two requirements being satisfied. The first requirement was a minimum deliberation period of 5 standard years from the date of the initial designation request, during which all available evidence and all available counter-evidence had to be formally admitted to the record. The second requirement was individual review, a separate and documented assessment of every known living member of the species, before any terminal action could be carried out. The deliberation period for the extinction vote had been 11 days. I had not received any form of individual review. I had been informed of the outcome at a reception, with a glass of fizzy liquid in my hand while music played in the background, while delegates helped themselves to food. I had spent 19 months building the case. I had consulted, through carefully framed academic queries that never identified their actual purpose, with 3 separate legal scholars whose published work on the Galactic Accord I had read in full. I had sourced 41 precedents from the Historical Legal Archive, including 6 cases where Article 12 had been applied retroactively to earlier decisions, establishing that retroactive application was both possible and had been found appropriate in cases where procedural violations had not been discovered until after terminal action had already commenced. I had mapped every counterargument that the Council's legal team was likely to raise and had constructed specific responses to each, sourced from the same legal scholarship the Council's own lawyers would use. The document was not designed to win immediately. It was designed to be technically impossible to dismiss without a full review process. Every procedural dismissal path the Council might try to use had a documented counter. Every jurisdictional argument had a response. Every time limitation claim had 6 precedents. The Council could fight it, but fighting it would take time, months at minimum, more likely years if they chose to contest each section. And during that time, the petition would exist on the public record, where every species in the galaxy with any stake in what the Council's handling of the case might mean for their own future security would have access to it and reason to pay attention to it. I filed it, publicly, through the standard judicial intake portal with full attribution. Clara Oren, Xenobiologist, Research Platform 7, Council Continuation Status, Article 12 of the Galactic Accord on Sapient Species Rights. The Council's automated intake system sent an acknowledgement within 4 hours. Then, 8 hours after that, an urgent classification notice. This petition has been designated a matter of Council-wide security concern and will be processed under emergency review protocols. Emergency review protocols meant 3 things. First, every part of my current status and situation would be under maximum scrutiny. Second, every procedural safeguard in the Council's own legal framework was now formally activated, meaning they could not take any action outside of those procedures without violating their own charter. Third, the emergency classification was itself a matter of public record, which meant the petition's existence was now visible to every monitoring system in the Council network. Every species delegation that subscribed to the judicial alert feed would see it. Every legal scholar with an interest in the Galactic Accord would see it. It could not be quietly buried. The emergency classification had made it too large to bury quietly. Elder Vin reached me through a secure channel 31 hours after I filed. His voice, which I had come to know well through text, and which I was now hearing for the first time, was measured and careful and sounded like someone who had not slept. He said, "The Venari situation has been handled. There was an administrative discrepancy in the facility's supply records, a categorization error that created the appearance of an irregular pattern. The error has been corrected through 3 separate committee certifications from the Vethari Science Committee, the Vethari Agricultural Research Directorate, and the Interspecies Research Coordination Office. The inquiry team will need to reconcile those 3 certifications against the original flagged records before they can determine whether there is anything that warrants physical inspection. That reconciliation process will take a minimum of 8 months under standard procedure." I said, "And the children?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dr. Gill and Dr. Ahev relocated with all viable materials. They departed Venari 14 hours ago. They are currently in transit. The destination is outside Council jurisdiction, and I will not name it on any channel under any circumstances. But I can tell you that the location exists, that it has the resources required to continue the work, and that it is not on any Council navigation chart currently in use. Outside Council jurisdiction, that meant deep space, unclaimed territory. The older star charts before the Council's expansion period, when there were still significant regions of the galaxy that no governing body had yet reached, the places that sovereignty had not yet arrived at. I thought about that. I thought about a transport ship moving through that kind of space, old space, uncharted space, carrying Nora and Orin and everything that had been built over the past 18 months on Venari, carrying it toward a place that did not exist on any map the Council owned. I thought about the fact that Elder Ven had a plan for exactly this contingency, that he had been building the exit route at the same time I had been building the legal case, in parallel and in silence, trusting that I would hold my end without needing to know the details of his. That for 18 months, while I was working on the platform and sending soil research and filing compliance forms, an old Vethari man in his ethics committee office had been quietly constructing the scaffolding that would catch what we were building if the platform gave way. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Do not thank me yet. The petition has created a significant political problem for 11 council members who would strongly prefer this matter to remain administratively closed. They will attempt to resolve it as rapidly as possible, and they have resources I do not have." I said, "I know. Rapid is acceptable. I only needed time and the time was used." A pause. He said, "How much time did you need?" I said, "They are already gone, aren't they?" He said, "The transport cleared the outer boundary of Vethari-adjacent space 4 hours before you filed the petition. 11 days to the sanctuary coordinates, if the routing holds." 11 days. The Council had spent 11 days deliberating the fate of my species. I noted the symmetry. I held it for a moment. Then I put it away, because dwelling on symmetries was a luxury and I did not currently have a surplus of those. I said, "I will handle what comes next." He said, "I know you will. I have been watching you work for almost 2 years. I have formed a strong view of your capacity." Then after a pause, "Are you afraid?" I thought about the question, the honest answer, not the useful one. I said, "Yes. I have been afraid since the reception with the fizzy drink, and I have kept working anyway. I think I can continue doing that." He said, "I believe you, without qualification." We ended the communication. I had 41 hours before the enforcement vessel arrived. I used them with complete intention, without hurry and without waste. I backed up my complete publication archive to 3 separate locations in the public Galactic database. I filed 3 additional research papers, all genuine, all based on real data accumulated over 4 years of legitimate xenobiology work, all written in the past few months specifically to be cited by other researchers long after I was no longer in a position to write new ones, because citations are a form of presence that outlasts the person doing the citing. I completed the cultural archive submission I had been working on the evening the inquiry notice arrived, because it deserved to be finished properly. I wrote a long letter, in plain language without any encryption or indirection, addressed to Nora and Orin and Fenari. I encrypted it under a key that only they had access to and labeled it, for when the time is right. I did not know when that would be. I knew it would be later than now, and I wrote for that later time as honestly as I could. Then I tidied the greenhouse. I checked the soil cultures. I walked through all 3 lab workrooms in order, closing things down that needed to be closed down, making sure everything was in the state that I would want to find it in if I were someone coming to this platform for the first time and needed to understand what kind of work had been done here and how carefully. The enforcement vessel docked cleanly, which was more than most of the transports that visited this platform had ever managed. 4 crew members, professional and unhurried. The lead officer was a Keth named Val. She offered me the shortened version unprompted. She handed me the containment order and waited while I read it. Containment. Not anything beyond containment. The petition was on the public record. The emergency classification had been noted by 6 delegations that had now formally contacted the Judicial Charter Office to register interest in the proceedings. and the Council could not take any step outside its own established legal framework without demonstrating precisely the kind of procedural disregard that the petition argued had characterized the extinction vote. Val said, "You will have a single room, access to a personal research terminal, and one supervised communication session per week." I said, "That is adequate." She looked at me steadily. She said, "You do not seem surprised by any of this." I said, "I have been expecting something like this for approximately 2 years." She looked around the platform, the greenhouse, the organized labs, the careful stacks of research. She said, "Is there anything you want to take with you?" I thought about it for a moment. I picked up the tablet from the desk, the one with the 2 photographs on it. I said just this. She nodded once. We left the platform together. I did not look back as the docking ring disconnected. Looking back at things is not a habit I have ever found useful. The containment room was a small, clean space with one viewport facing open space, a desk, a research terminal, and a bed at the right height for once. They had made some effort with it. The temperature was correctly calibrated, and the lighting had 2 settings, and there was a small shelf that could hold books or tablets or whatever a researcher found necessary to have near them. It was the size of a room built for the purpose it served rather than larger, and I had lived in field accommodations that were considerably worse, and I found that I did not mind it in the way I might have expected to mind it. What I minded was the window. Not because it was bad, it was a good window, clean and properly sealed, with a view that on any other occasion would have been something I appreciated. I minded it because the stars it showed me were not moving, and I had been moving continuously for so long, through so many versions of the same day, that the stillness felt like a form of pressure. But still was fine. Still was what I had, and I had learned over the past 2 years to work with what I had. The first formal review of the petition was scheduled for the 42nd day of my containment. I used the 31 days before it the way I had learned to use any defined block of time, with a plan that left nothing unused. My weekly communication session was dedicated entirely to legal work. I filed supplemental materials for the petition every single week without exception, and I filed them in the spirit of someone who intends to exhaust every line of argument available before accepting that any of them has been closed. Each supplemental added new material, precedents from the pre-council legal archive that I had been mining systematically since before I filed the original document, expert citations drawn from academic publications that the council's legal team had apparently not cross-referenced, additional witnesses from the galactic research community, who had submitted formal statements of concern about the precedent implications of the case. The council's legal team requested a 2-week extension before the first hearing to review the supplemental filings. The independent judicial panel granted 1 week. I filed another supplemental during that week. The hearing took place on the 42nd day. I attended via research terminal feed, which Val approved with the same efficient professionalism she brought to everything. 5 judges on the panel, 3 independent, 2 council-affiliated, and a hearing that ran for 4 hours. The council's legal team presented 3 primary arguments for dismissal. First, that the petition had been filed outside the permissible submission window. Second, that Article 12 did not apply retroactively. Third, that the surviving specimen status under which I operated constituted a form of individual review that satisfied the Article 12 requirement. My filings addressed all 3 arguments with specific citations. The third argument, that my continued existence as a supervised specimen constituted individual review, I had specifically anticipated and had prepared the most detailed counter for, because it was the most substantively wrong and the most important to refute clearly. Individual review under Article 12 meant an assessment of whether terminal action was appropriate in the specific case of the individual being reviewed. It did not mean informing the individual that the terminal action had already been carried out on everyone else. These were not the same thing. The distinction was so clear in the relevant precedent that it required only 2 pages of supplemental material to establish, which I had filed 3 weeks earlier when I first identified that argument as one the council was likely to make. The independent judges asked 23 questions over the course of the hearing. 17 of them the council's team could not answer satisfactorily and requested additional time to address. The panel did not dismiss the petition. It marked it for continued review, which meant it remained on the public record, which was what mattered. After the hearing, I sat at the desk in the containment room and thought about what continued review meant and what it would require and how long it was likely to take. And I worked out that the council was going to be dealing with this file for a minimum of 2 years before they could close it cleanly, more if I kept finding things to add, which I intended to do. The 6th week brought a message from Elder Venn, sent through a route that had taken some ingenuity to establish. The Vethari Ethics Committee had brought his motion to a second vote, the motion requesting that the original extinction vote be formally designated as a procedural violation pending independent review. The first vote had been 8-6. The second vote was 9-5. 9-5. One member had moved from against to in favor since the first vote. I sat with that number for a while. A committee member who votes against a motion does not typically reverse that vote without a reason, and a reason strong enough to move a council committee member means a reason that is likely to move others over time, because committee members talk to each other and watch each other and take their cues from the movement in the room. The abstention that had blocked the first motion had not appeared in the second. The person who had abstained had voted no. But a no in that count was still an improvement on what the count had been before, because it represented a real distribution of positions rather than a false consensus, and real distributions of positions are things that can be worked on. I filed 3 more supplementals that month. Val had developed a pattern with the meal trays. She brought them herself rather than having a junior crew member do it, which was not required by my containment terms and which she had never explained. She set them on the desk with the same measured efficiency she applied to everything, and sometimes she paused on her way back out and stood near the viewport for a moment, not looking at me, looking at the stars, before continuing. I had decided not to ask about this, because some things are better let alone to develop at their own pace. On the 16th day, she set down a tray and said, without particular emphasis, that was a thorough filing, the week 3 supplemental. I said, I have been working on the overall argument for 2 years. She said, I know, I read the original petition. I looked at her. She continued looking at the viewport. She said, the argument about individual review is very clear. I said, the precedent on that point is strong. She said, yes. Then she said, I am going to go file my evening report now. I said, of course. She left. I sat with that exchange for a long time. She had read 47 pages of dense legal argument in her own time without being required to. She had singled out the individual review argument, which was the clearest part of the document, and the part most directly about what had and had not been done. She had offered no opinion, made no commitment, and said nothing that was not technically neutral. And she had done all of this, and then said she was going to file her evening report, which told me that whatever she had taken away from reading the petition, it was not something she was going to put in that report tonight. I noted it. I filed it where I keep things that might matter later. I did not push it. The weeks continued their rhythm. Mornings on the legal work. Afternoons on the continuation mandate, which I had decided from the beginning to execute with complete diligence, because a clean and visible compliance record was an argument in itself. It said, with the consistency of action rather than the assertion of words, that this was a researcher doing legitimate work, that the work was real, that there was no reasonable basis for characterizing it as anything else. I wanted every auditor who ever reviewed my continuation record to see the same thing. A person doing her assigned work carefully and well, with nothing out of place. In the evenings I wrote. Not the legal filings, those had their own time and their own discipline. In the evenings I wrote the things that were not legal arguments. The letter I had started in my last days on the platform had grown very long by now, accumulated across many nights, full of things I wanted to say to people I could not currently reach. I told them, the petition is real and it is moving. Elder Ven counts votes every week and the count is moving. Not fast and not in a straight line because councils do not move in straight lines. They move in the way that large things move when they encounter sustained pressure slowly with resistance, and then at some tipping point faster than anyone predicted. We are not at the tipping point yet. We are in the sustained pressure stage. I am providing the pressure. That is my current function, and I am performing it without any intention of stopping. I told them, you will hear from people, eventually, who say that what was done to Earth was a tragedy, but that it was also in some complicated way understandable, that humanity was genuinely difficult to integrate into galactic structures, that the Council made a hard decision under pressure with imperfect information, that the past should stay in the past. Listen to all of it carefully. Then remember that the deliberation lasted 11 days. Then remember that the individual review consisted of a glass of fizzy liquid and a young man with too many teeth telling me to feel honored. Then decide for yourself whether the explanation explains the thing being explained. I told them, I am not angry in the way that I expected to be angry. I am something quieter than that and I think more durable. I am the kind of determined that comes from doing the same thing very carefully for a long time and watching it slowly accumulate into something real. I think that is the useful kind. I have found it to be the useful kind so far. The 31st day of my containment arrived with an audio file in the academic data channel, tucked inside a standard research packet moving between institutions. No label, no header, nothing to distinguish it from the other data packets that moved through that channel in their hundreds every day. I put in my earpiece and played it. Multiple voices. Young, uneven, many of them still figuring out what notes were supposed to sound like, and not all finding them on the first try. They were singing together, which was the important thing, not well necessarily, but together. One voice was trying noticeably harder than the others, and was also noticeably louder than was strictly necessary, in the way of someone who has decided that effort and volume are related. One voice dissolved into laughter approximately 2/3 of the way through, and then came back and finished anyway, slightly behind the others and not quite caring. I recognized the melody in the third bar. It was an old one, the kind that no one formally teaches but that moves from person to person across generations because it is shaped correctly for carrying, not too complex to hold in memory, not too simple to feel like anything. My grandmother had known it. She had sung it in the kitchen while she cooked, always slightly off-key, always louder than the room required. They sang it all the way to the end. I sat without moving. I played it again. And again. I played it 6 times in a row and then I sat with my hands flat on the desk and looked at the viewport and the stillness of the stars beyond it and thought about the word that Fenari had told me one of them had learned first, out of all the words available in a facility full of people who could have taught them any word at all. Again. One syllable. The word that refuses to accept that something is over. The word that treats an ending as a pause. The word that says, there is more of this, I have not decided to be done with it, bring me the next part. I thought about what kind of people they would be. Not what kind of humans. I had my ideas about that, and they were not fixed ideas, because fixed ideas about what a person will be are almost always wrong. I thought about what kind of people, in the full and open sense of that word, what they would be curious about, what would make them laugh, what they would find worth working on for a long time, what they would do when they encountered something that seemed determined to stop them. I thought they would probably figure that out for themselves. I thought that was good. I thought that was exactly right. The second formal hearing of the petition was 3 weeks after the audio file arrived. I had filed 9 supplementals since the first hearing. The independent panel had now received formal statements of concern from 14 species delegations, 11 of which had identified the individual review provision specifically as the point of greatest concern to them. Not because they were committed allies, not because they had made any decision about my specific case, but because the question of what individual review meant and when it was required was a question with implications that extended well beyond my specific case. And 14 species delegations had noticed that. The Council's legal team appeared at the second hearing with 3 new arguments and significantly more material. They had been working hard. I noted this with something like respect, because it meant they were taking the petition seriously enough to put real resources into countering it, which meant they had assessed that it could not be quickly dismissed, which was what I had intended it to be impossible to do. The panel asked 31 questions this time. The hearing ran for 6 hours. At the end of it, the senior independent judge said, for the record, that the panel found the procedural questions raised by the petition to be substantively significant and would require full briefing from both parties before issuing any preliminary ruling. Full briefing meant 90 additional days minimum. 90 days was 90 more supplementals. I was already planning the sequence. After the hearing, Val brought a meal tray and stood near the viewport for longer than usual. She said, "The panel's language was strong. Substantively significant is not the kind of phrase they use for cases they expect to close quickly." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "How long do you think the full review will take?" I said, "In my estimate, between 2 and 4 years, depending on how extensively the Council contests each section and how many other species file formal statements. The record suggests that each additional statement of concern adds between 3 and 6 weeks to the review timeline." She said, 14 statements already." I said, "As of this morning, yes." A pause. She looked at the stars. She said, "I grew up on a Vethari border station. Small, 12 species rotating through on 4-year cycles. When I was young, I did not know very much about the species that came through. I learned by watching what different people did with a 4-year posting on a station that was, objectively, not very interesting." I said, "What did you learn?" She said, "That the interesting ones found ways to make it interesting, and that the ones who could not find ways to make it interesting had usually decided in advance what kind of place it was." She picked up the tray she had brought. She said, "I will see you tomorrow." I said, "Thank you, Val." She nodded once and left. I sat at the desk for a long time after she left, not working, just sitting. The stars were very still beyond the viewport. I had spent 2 years on the research platform learning to be comfortable with the particular quality of stillness that deep space produces. Not the stillness of a quiet room, which has the sounds of a building around it, but the stillness of a place so large that stillness is simply its natural state. I had stopped finding it lonely. I had started finding it clarifying, the way a very clean surface is clarifying. Nothing extra to look at, so you see what is there more clearly. What was there was this: a petition, filed and running, a record, clean and consistent, a tally of delegations moving, an audio file saved 4 times to different locations in case any single one was lost, of young voices singing something off-key and not stopping, and a letter, still growing, addressed to the future I had spent 2 years building. I picked up the tablet and opened the letter. I had added to it many times since I left the platform, in the spaces between filings and hearings and meal trays and conversations near the viewport. It had become something larger than I had intended when I started it. Not a message, but a record. Not an instruction, but a description. The description of a person who had found herself in an impossible situation and had decided, without any particular drama, to treat it as a research problem, and apply the same methodology she had always applied to research problems. Gather everything available, assess what you actually have rather than what you wish you had, form a hypothesis, test it carefully, record the results, and revise as needed. The hypothesis had been, continuity is possible. The test was still running. The results were encouraging. I wrote the petition review will take years. That is fine. Time was always the resource I had most of, and the thing I was building always required more time than anything else. Elder Vin moves one vote at a time on the committee. That is fine. One vote at a time is how committees move. Val stands at the viewport for longer periods each week and says things that are not quite neutral, and then files reports that are technically accurate about what was said and leave out the parts that are harder to categorize. That is fine too. I do not know exactly what it will add up to. I know that things are adding up. I wrote, you are going to be asked someday whether it was worth it, whether the effort was proportionate to the outcome, whether the cost to me, to Elder Ven, to Nora and Oren and Fenari, to every person who took a risk on behalf of something that had no guarantee attached to it, was justified by what the effort produced. I cannot answer that question for you. I can only tell you what I believe, which is that the calculation that produces the question is using the wrong variable. The question assumes the cost is paid against a fixed outcome. It is not. The cost is paid against the continuation of the question itself, the question of what is possible, asked by people who have decided not to accept other people's answers to it. That question continues as long as there is someone asking it. You are the question. You are also the askers. Those two things are not in tension. They are the same thing from different angles. I wrote, I am fine. I want you to know that clearly and without qualification. I am in a small room with a good viewport and a desk at the right height, and a legal case that is going to occupy a significant portion of the Council's judicial resources for the next several years. And I am doing exactly the work I intended to be doing, and I am not suffering in any way that matters. I miss certain things. I miss the greenhouse. I miss the particular smell of the soil cultures, and the way the light came through the growing panels in the afternoon cycle. I miss the platform's cooling system dropping half a tone at night, which I had stopped noticing until it was gone, and which I notice now by its absence. I do not miss those things in a way that makes me want to stop what I am doing. I miss them the way you miss a place you loved and left because there was somewhere more important to be. I wrote, learn the end game, learn it well, come back and tell me how the game went. I closed the tablet. I looked at the viewport. The stars were still, the way they are always still from inside a room. I was still moving. I had been moving for 2 years in ways that looked like stillness from the outside, and I intended to continue for as many more years as the situation required. The next supplemental filing was due in 4 days. I had 600 pages of historical legal scholarship still to process for relevant precedents. Val would bring a meal tray in the morning and possibly stand near the viewport for a few minutes, and I would not push the conversation, and it would develop at its own pace, which was the correct pace. Elder Ven would send a vote count in 10 days, approximately, and the count would be different from the last one, and the difference would be small but real, and small but real was the only kind of progress that stuck. And somewhere past the edges of the council's maps, in a place that was being made into something by the people living in it, 22 people who did not yet know what the word human meant in any full sense were learning the names of things, learning games that were deliberately difficult, learning old songs that nobody formally taught but that found their way from person to person anyway, slightly off-key, louder than necessary, refusing to stop before the end. They were asking the question. They were the question. They were also the reason the question mattered. My name is Clara Oren. I am 36 years old. I was born in a small town in northern England where the rain came in sideways and the moors stretched away in every direction, and the sky was the color of old pewter half the year, And I grew up in a house that smelled of library books and damp wool, and the particular quality of a kitchen that has someone in it who sings while they cook. I became a xenobiologist because I wanted to understand how life manages to grow in places that seem determined to stop it. I have spent my career in those places. I have found the same answer every time, in every environment, at every scale. Life does not grow in difficult places because it makes a decision to be noble. It grows because it is what life does, in whatever crack is available, without requiring the crack to be large or the conditions to be good or anyone to have voted in favor of it. The council declared my species extinct. They were not wrong about what they did. They were wrong about what it meant. What it meant was that there were fewer of us, and in different places, and with more to prove and more reason to prove it and more clarity about why the proof mattered. The petition is running. The votes are moving. The file will not close. The stars are still from in here, and I am still moving, and there are young voices somewhere past the edge of the map singing something off-key and louder than necessary, finishing what they started. We do not accept other people's conclusions about what is possible. We never have. We fill the cracks available to us, and we keep growing, and we sing slightly off-key, and we refuse to stop before the end. We never have. We never will.